Masechet Yevamot, Daf Chaf Aleph. We've been discussing the question of whether a Kohen Gadol can perform Yibum with an Almanah. The problem is a Kohen Gadol is prohibited to an Almanah, so that's a Lo Ta'aseh. And if the Almanah was actually married to the deceased, then that would be another problem that she's not a Betula and would be a Aseh and a Lo Ta'aseh. So in that case, Misvat Aseh Yibum would not override an Aseh and a Lo Ta'aseh. But our question is regarding if the original brother only did Kiddushin with his wife and then died. And so now the Yevamah falls to the Kohen Gadol, and she is an Almanah, so that is a Lo Ta'aseh. But because they did not consummate their marriage with Nisu'in, so she is still a Betula. In that case, it's only a Lo Ta'aseh. And we asked, how come we don't have an Aseh, Doche Lo Ta'aseh, and allow the Kohen Gadol to perform Yibum? And we saw already one answer by Rav and three different answers by Rava. The last one being that it's a gezerah. You're right, midoraita, you could, but a gezerah, we're afraid that he should only do one bi'ah, and if we allow that, then he's going to remain married to her and have more bi'ot. But he already did the mitzvah, and there's no need for them to remain married, so that's why we make a gezerah, do not do yibum at all. Okay, so we have that fourth answer, which is fine, but now we're going to attempt a fifth answer. Hadad Amar Rava, and this is Rava himself that says, oh, you know what? I thought of yet a fifth answer. Others say, no, it wasn't Rava, but rather later, Amora Rav Asher, that is the sixth generation, as opposed to Rava in the fourth generation, that proposed the following answer. And it says, Lav militahi amari. Well, these words, it sounds like Rava said it. Oh, what I just said, I changed my mind. And based on Resh Lakish. Resh Lakish has this general principle. Kol makom she'ata moseh, aseh v'lo ta'aseh, im ata yachol lakayim shenehem mutav, v'im lav yabo aseh v'yidche lo ta'aseh. Resh Lakish's general principle is when you have a contradiction between the misvat aseh and the misvat lo ta'aseh, and you can't fulfill both. Well, if you cannot fulfill both, then he agrees. The aseh comes and overrides the lo ta'aseh. But if there is any way to actually fulfill both, that you won't violate the lo ta'aseh, and you can also fulfill the misvat aseh, then you have to do that. All right, you cannot, aseh will not override the lo ta'aseh if there is a way out that you can fulfill both of them. And that applies to this case, because the Kohen Gadol can perform chalitza, and by doing chalitza, he does not violate taking an almanah. And he has no problem with the misvat aseh. So misvat aseh to do yibum is true, but you don't have to do it if you do chalitza. And so therefore he has a way out. And if you have a way out, then the principle aseh dochelot aseh does not apply. And that's why a Kohen Gadol cannot do yibum. Very nice, easy solution. Why don't we think of this in the first place? But actually, it's not so easy because we reject it. Metibeh bim ba'alu kanu. In this baraita that we actually just quoted, we quoted just a snippet from it, and we see that bidi abad. If a Kohen Gadol does do bi'ah, then it works. She becomes his wife. The yibum takes effect. And according to this reasoning of Resh Lakish, if on a deoraita level, we do not apply aseh doche lo ta'aseh, and therefore he's not permitted to do yibum. In that case, if you're not permitted to do yibum, and then you go and do it anyway, then there's no mitzvah that's done. And in fact, it's simply erva of eshet ach and the prohibition of almanah. And this would be like a case where there's nisur karet also. If he goes and does it, then it does not take effect at all. And so, according to your logic, even bidi avad, it should not take effect. And yet, the baraita says bidi avad, it does take effect. And therefore, we say tiyufta. So this is a rejection of this response by that's based on Resh Lakish, whoever said it, either Rav Asher said it or Rava said it. It's a bit strange if Rava said it because he knows this baraita, he just quoted it here himself. So why would he reject his fourth answer and bring a fifth answer if that fifth answer doesn't even fit with the fourth, fit with the baraita that he already knows? Okay, but this challenge is going to come again in the next sugya, and I think there it'll make more sense. So we continue. Itemar, biat kohen gadol ba'amana, Rabbi Yochanan ve'Rabbi Elazar. Hadamar ena poteret tzarata, v'chadamar poteret tzarata. Okay, so even though we just gave 5 different answers to that question, and now we have a related machloket, this time from Moraim from Eretz Israel, that if the Kohen Gadol does perform hadbi'ah, perform yibum with an almana, so there's a machloket between these 2 sages. One says, and not poteret sarata, that bi'ah does not take effect, does not do yibum, and the co-wife would not be exempt. And the other says that, yes, it does take effect, even to the extent that the co-wife is exempt, right? Because if there are co-wives, once one co-wife does yibum, the other is free to go. Okay, so they are arguing on this very question of, on a b'diavad level, does it work or not? Okay, so now we clarify the question. Clarify the machloket. If the original brother who died was married to her, to the Yevamot before he died, full nisuin, then everyone agrees that if the Kohen Gadol comes and takes her, it would be ineffective, nothing. It would be simply prohibited, and the co-wife would not go free. Because there's no way that the misvat aseh of yibum can override both the lo ta'aseh of being with an almanah and an aseh that he has to be with a betula. And so therefore, because it does not override both, the yibum is invalid. It does not take effect, and the co-wife is still prohibited. The question is, if the brother who died only performed kiddushin, he only gave her a ring, and therefore she is still a betula. The opinion that says that when the Kohen Gadol does take her, then it does take effect as yibum, and the co-wife is free to go. And he would say, good, the misvat aseh overrides the lo ta'aseh. And the one who says no, it does not take effect would say, la aseh v'dacheh et lo ta'aseh, kevan de'efshar b'halisa. It does not take effect because aseh will not override a lo ta'aseh, even though in general, in other cases, there is a rule that aseh overrides a lo ta'aseh. Here, not so, because you have a way out and you can do halisa. And since you can do chalisa, so then you cannot do yibum, and the yibum is ineffective. So that's the machloket between these 2 amoraim. And now we challenge the last opinion. Metibeh v'im ba'alu kanu. Same baraita we just said, because bidi avad, the baraita says that it works. And according to this last opinion that says and not poteret, that it does not take effect. So it does not take effect because the mitzvah yibum does not apply, cannot override. Well, then even b'di avad, the yibum should not work. But yet here the baraita says that it does work to yuftan. So therefore we reject the second opinion and we go with the first opinion that says if the Kohen Gadol does take the Yevamot, then the yibum is effective and the co-wife is free to go and marry anyone she wants. Okay, good. Last point on this subject. Wait a second. Maybe since you already now that we rejected the application to yibum, maybe we should reject the entire statement of Resh Lakish, right? Because Resh Lakish says that misvah aseh is doche lo ta'aseh unless there is a way out, and you can do chalisa. And then it's not doche. And since we rejected the application here, so maybe that means his entire rule is rejected. Amar lach Resh Lakish, ki amina ana hechad mekayem mitzvah, aval lacha chalisa b'mkom yibum la mitzvah hi. But Resh Lakish could defend his rule and say that his rule is true, but it is not applicable to this case of yibum and chalitza, because he says, I only said my rule when you can find a way out in which you can actually perform the mitzvah and also avoid the lo ta'aseh. But in this case, the way out is through halisa. Halisa is not actually fulfilling the mitzvah of yibum. And so according to him, the main mitzvah is to perform yibum. Now, if you don't like her, she doesn't like him, whatever reason, they can't do it, they don't want to do it, so you do chalisa, but chalisa does not fulfill any mitzvah. So this way out is not really a way out. It's true, it's a way out that you won't violate the law ta'aseh, but you're not fulfilling the mitzvah ta'aseh. And that's why the Shakish himself would not even apply his own rule in this case. And so the fact that it does not work in this case is not any is not an objection to Resh Lakish's rule. Resh Lakish's rule is in fact upheld. Our next topic are the shiniyot, the secondary category of prohibited relations that the Mishnah mentioned as isur mitzvah, in which case, if someone like that falls to yibum, one must perform halisa. We're going to list what these relations are, but first, we're going to bring 4 derivations or hints from the Torah that we know from Tanakh that are the source that the rabbis should add these secondary relations to the original Torah prohibitions. So the first one, Amar Rava, remez lishniyot min haTorah minayin. What's a hint from the Torah that the rabbi should add these secondary prohibited relations? Shene'emar ki et kol hato'evot ha'el asu anshe ha'aretz. Ha'el kashot. Regarding in the summary pasuk of all of the arayot, it says all of these abominations, ha'el, and it calls them these. Ha'el is short for ha'ele, but because it's short, the word el also means something harsh. It is God's name, but the derivation of it comes from something that is strong. That's why it is one of God's names, meaning like the Almighty. So these are called, these 21 relations that are listed in Vayikra 18 are the harsh prohibitions, and that suggests that there are another category of ones that are less harsh, that are less stringent. And so these are the secondary relations. Okay. Where do we see that the word ha'el means something that is harsh? In Yechezkel, right, they took away the mighty ones. So that means mighty. So these are the mighty prohibitions, but there are then more lenient prohibitions too. Okay, lema pelika did be Levi. If that's what this means, then this seems to contradict what Rabbi Levi said. Amar Rabbi Levi, kashe onashin shel midot, yoter me'onashin shel arayot, shezen emar bahen el, v'zen emar bahen ele. El kashe ve'ele kashe me'el. Okay, Rabbi Levi said something quite astounding, that the punishment for false measures, if someone has a weight that's says a pound, but it's actually bigger or smaller than a pound, and he uses that to cheat when he's buying or selling, that the punishment of that is worse than incest. Why? Because regarding incest, it says just the word el, but regarding false measures, right, here's the context in Devarim 25, right, and so on. The next pasuk, ki toavat Adonai Elohecha kol ose ele. So here the word ele being more stringent than the word el. And so doesn't this seem to contradict what he said? Because according to this, the word ele is strict and the word el means not strict. And Rava just said that el means something that is very stringent. And the answer is, no, there are 2 levels. El means something that is very harsh. Ele is even more strict. So we have a hierarchy. The false measures is the worst, and then comes the arayot that are mentioned in the Torah, but it still suggests that there is yet another category of less stringent prohibited relations, and that would be the shiniyot. Good. Hold on. Even regarding arayot, in the couple of pisukim after the one we quoted in Vayikra 18, it summarizes as ki kol asher ya'asem mikol hato'evot ha'ele, and so he uses the word ele even for these. Oh, this word ha'ele is coming to teach me that only these get the punishment of karet, right? That's the rest of the pasuk. So one might have thought, because there is similar language between false measures and arayot, that just like arayot one receives karet, so too, if someone uses false measures, the punishment is karet. That's why this word ele comes to say these only prohibitions of arayot receive karet, but false measures, although in some way it's harsher, as we just said, it does not receive karet. Okay, so it doesn't receive karet, the punishment is less. So then we ask, Ela, mai chumraihu. So in what way are false measures more stringent if the punishment is less? And the answer is hane efshar b'tshuva, hane la efshar b'tshuva. Regarding regarding adayot, one can make teshuvah. As long as a mamzer is not born from it, which then you can't recover from. But if it's only a prohibited relation, then we have a process of teshuvah that is spelled out by Rambam, and one goes through that process, and then one can do teshuvah. Whereas if someone uses false measures, then it's not just like stealing from breaking into a house and stealing from one person. Then you can return it. If you're using false measures, that means you're using it all the time. Whenever you're buying, whenever you're selling, you're using it for institutions and companies, and so you're stealing from the public. And there's no way to track down each and every person from whom you stole. And then in that case, it's impossible to make teshuvah for consistent use of false measures. And that's the sense in which using false measures is even worse than arayot. So really an amazing statement. Okay, that was the first derivation. Second, Rav Yehuda Amar Mehacha v'izen v'chiker tiken mishalim harben kohelet. It says that King Shlomo weighed and sought out and made many proverbs to help understand things. Amar ula amar Rabbi Elazar kodem sheba Shlomo hayta Torah doma lichfifa she'en la oznayim ad sheba Shlomo v'asa la oznayim. Before King Shlomo came, the Torah was like a basket without handles that you can't hold on to it. And he came and made handles for it. Here's like a basket that originally was without handles and then hard to hold. And so, right on the outside, one attaches handles, and now you're able to carry it around. So too, the Torah was difficult to understand. And it's only through parables. You say, what is this like? And then you give an explanation, reason for various things, then you can understand it. Okay, we're bringing this in as to say that the Torah law itself is impossible to uphold just by itself, because we need added gezerot. Right? If we have only the Torah, then it's like coming too close to a ledge, and then people will fall off. And right, so the Torah is just giving you the bare bones, but we have to add in more, right? Just like in the basket, adding more material actually makes it easier to handle. So too, the Rabbanan gezerot that fill in other things that people will come and make a mistake with. And when you fill those in, then it's actually easier to fulfill all of the Torah and not get tripped up and make mistakes. And so this is a source for the general idea that it's good to add, just like you add mishalim to understand something original, you add other drabanan gezerot to protect the original laws. Third derivation, Rabbi Oshaya Amar Mehacha Pera'ehu al ta'abor bo sete me'alav va'abor. Peshat is talking about reshaim, or bad places. Avoid it. Don't pass by it. Turn from it. Pass on. Right? If you know there's some spot where there's evildoers, don't even go near it. Right? Go on the road, on the side road, all around it, and don't even come next to that which may be tempting. Regarding this, Amar Rav Asher, mashal, he's going to give a mashal. We just talked about mishalim, so there's mashal to understand what he meant by this. Le'adam mishamer pardes mishameron b'bachutz kolo mishtamer, mishameron b'bifnim shelefanav mishtamer, shelacharav eno mishtamer. Although he was talking about going on the road and avoiding something bad, this mashal applies it to a watchman who should stand outside. If the watchman is guarding an orchard, he should stand on the outside to make sure no one goes in at all. Whereas if the watchman is guarding inside, then he can only guard that which is behind him, but that which is in front of him, Well, this is the opposite. If he's inside, then what's in front of him, what he's looking at, he can be watched, but someone can sneak around behind him, and then that won't be watched. And the point is that once you let a thief in, then they're going to be able to take some things. You have to stand outside and make sure that the thief doesn't even come anywhere near the produce that's inside. And so too, the rabbis have to make gezerot, so that we don't even enter the prohibited area. And so we add a fence so that we will stay fully outside. By the way, this mashal that Rav Asher brought is itself not accurate. In that case, at least the guard can watch what's in front of him. Right, he can see it. Whereas if we don't add the secondary, the sheniyot, the secondary level of arayot, then people will come to sin, even regarding the forbidden relations themselves, because they'll compare this one to that one and say, oh, this is allowed and that's allowed. And so a guard that's inside can at least guard half of the things. Whereas if the rabbis do not make these gezerot, then nothing will be guarded. So the reality is even worse than what's in that mashal. All right, and now the last source, Rav Kahana Amar Mehacha, Ushmartem et Mishmarti. You should protect my possessions. Right? The Torah is Mishmarti, is what Hashem said. You have to guard, and you have to put a fence around the things that I said to guard. Asu mishmeret li mishmarti. Right? Make a gate for my gate. So that means that this authorizes the rabbis to add further prohibitions to guard the Torah prohibitions. Amale Abaye le Rav Yosef. Ha deoraita hi deoraita upirshu ufereshu Rabbanan. So Abaye says, wait, according to this, you quoted a pasuk, and if you're quoting a pasuk, then that one means that these sheniyot would actually be deoraita, because the Torah itself is saying add another level. He says, no. It's the requirement to add something is doraita, but the details of what to add, that's what the rabbis said, right? So Torah doesn't say exactly what it is. So it is still the Rabbanan, because the rabbis decided what should be in there. Wait a second. Wait, but that's true for every law in the Torah, right? Think of every law in the Torah. It says blow shofar. How do you blow shofar? When do you blow shofar? Build a sukkah. How do you build it? Don't do melacha. What's a melacha? All the details of every deoraita law are explicated by the rabbis, and that they remain deoraita. They're just explanations. And so here too, if the Torah says add safeguards to the adayot, then those would be still an explanation of a doraita, which would be deoraita. So you're saying that these are doraita? This is no. Rather, no. All of these sheniyot, la'adayot are actually drabanan, and this pasuk that says mishmet mishmarti is just a support for the rabbis to do that, but it's not the peshat of the pasuk. Is not saying that one has to make a secondary level. It's just like, be very careful with these. That's all the peshat means, and then the rabbis use this as a hook to find support to say, in order to be careful, we have to add these other derabanan prohibitions as a safeguard. And so these are 4 derivations for that legitimate the rabbinic addition of these sheniyot la arayot. We now have a baraita with the list of those who are sheniyot, the secondary forbidden relations. Tenora banan mahem hasheniyot. I'll read them all, then I'll show you a chart. Em imo ve'em aviv, grandmother, eshet aviv ve'eshet avi imo, ve'eshet achi ha'av min ha'em, ve'eshet achi ha'av min ha'av, ve'kalat beno ve'kalat bito. Those are prohibited. Umutar adam be'eshet chamir be'eshet horgo. So here are the exceptions that are permitted. Be'asur be'bat horgo. Horgo means a stepson. Be'chorgo mutar be'ishto u'bito. So let's see all of these cases where we start off with em imo. These are all not said in the Torah. But the rabbis come and say, obviously, these have to be prohibited. A person is prohibited with his mother's mother, his grandmother from his mother, or his grandmother from his father. Also, his grandfather's wife, who's not his grandmother, she's just married, like a step grandmother, is prohibited from his father's side and from also his mother's father's wife, also his step grandmother is prohibited. Now, Eshet Achi Ha'av Min Ha'em. So this would be his aunt from his father's maternal, right? So it says half aunt is prohibited. And also Eshet Achi Ha'em Min Ha'av, or if it's his mother's paternal brother's wife is also prohibited, although his mother's maternal brother's wife would actually be permitted because that's 2 steps away from the original prohibition. Okay, his someone's son's daughter-in-law is prohibited, Shiniyot, and his daughter-in-law from his son, his daughter-in-law from his daughter's daughter-in-law also prohibited. And this case is permitted. Be'eshet Hamiv. So Moshe is married to Zilpah, and this is her father. So that's his father-in-law. His father-in-law is married to another woman, and they are permitted. Should Yosef die or they get divorced, the son-in-law is permitted to his father-in-law's wife. That case is prohibited. Mutar be'eshet horgo, v'asur be'bat horgo. So if someone has it's the wife of a stepson. So you have a person here. He has a stepson. It's his wife's son from a previous marriage. A person is permitted to his stepson's wife, obviously after he dies or divorced, but is prohibited to his daughter, because that would be his wife's granddaughter, and that would be prohibited. The Gemara is going to ask about this because this is even prohibited in the Torah. And the next case is Chorgo Mutar be'ishto ubebito, a person's stepson, right? The son of his wife from a different previous marriage is allowed to marry his father-in-law's other wife, or his father-in-law's daughter from another marriage. Those are permitted. Okay, these are mother and daughter. So obviously, if he takes one, he can't take the other, but he can take one or the other. And so that is the list of prohibitions of shiniyot. And then the Baraita continues and notes a kind of interesting situation that ve'eshet chorgo omedet lo ani muteret lecha ubeti asura lecha. Stepson's wife, right? Back to this case here. This is a stepson, and his wife is permitted. And so she can say, "Hey, listen, I am permitted to you, even though her daughter, she says, my daughter is prohibited to you mideoraita." And so it's just an interesting situation because usually the rabbis come and they will prohibit cases that are similar to something deoraita, and yet here is a case where they do not, even though this is his wife's son's daughter is prohibited to him, right? Because his wife's granddaughter is prohibited midoraita. Nevertheless, the rabbis did not prohibit his stepson's wife, and so she can say that. That's the end of the Baraita. And the Gemara is now going to analyze it and says, Bat Chorgo, Doraita hi dichtivet bat benavet bat pita. One of these cases that we just mentioned is in fact midoraita, not shiniyot, because the pasuk after all says one's wife's granddaughter, right, from her son or daughter are prohibited. That's the midoraita. So what is it doing here? The answer is Mishum dekaba el mitnei sefa, because we wanted to mention the next case of Eshet Cholgo Omeret Lo Ani Muteret Lecha B'ti Asura Lecha. We wanted to note that though his stepson's wife can say, "I am permitted to you, just my daughter is not." So that's why we mentioned the case. And her point is, in saying that, is even though my daughter is asur to you midoraita, I am permitted totally, not even the gezerah, because we wanted to mention that case. That's why beforehand we mentioned this case, even though it is asur midoraita. Now we ask, based on that logic, Ihachi eshet hamiv name tema. How come we don't mention the same statement regarding this case of his father-in-law's wife, which is also permitted, right? That's his wife's his wife's father, other wife. Is permitted to him, even though her daughter is prohibited. Her daughter is prohibited because that's his wife's sister. So she's prohibited as a wife's sister. How come over here also the Baraita doesn't point out that she can say to him, "I am permitted to you, even though my daughter is prohibited"? That's another similar kind of paradox. And the answer is hapesikale, hapesikale. In the previous case, they are prohibited. Always, right? She will be prohibited as his wife's granddaughter, always, no matter what happens. Whereas in this case, since the prohibition is only because of wife's sister, but if Esther should die, then he is permitted to the other sister. He will be permitted to his father-in-law's other daughter. And so therefore, she cannot say, my daughter is prohibited, because it's only temporarily prohibited. There is a case where she could be permitted. Amar Rav, arba nashim yesh lahen hefsek. Rav is going to tell us something interesting. There are some cases where once someone is prohibited, it goes even previously many generations, or even their descendants for many generations. For example, as we say, one of the sheniot is a grandmother, and so that includes not only a grandmother, but a great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother, all the way back forever. Those will all be prohibited, no matter what generation. Rav is saying that 4 of the cases, yesh nefsek, meaning it stops there and it does not go beyond generation backwards or forwards. Although he said this 4, he only specified 3 of them. We'll see why. So here's the 3. Eshet achi ha'em min ha'av, eshet achi ha'av min ha'em, ve'kalato. So let's see each one. Each of these is prohibited, but an added generation is not prohibited. So one case is his mother's paternal brother, his wife, right? So it's his aunt from his mother's side, his mother's paternal brother. That is prohibited. But if you add another generation here to be his mother's paternal brother's wife, then that is permitted. And similarly, if you go father's maternal brother, in these 2 cases, it goes only 1 generation back. But if you add another generation, then it is permitted. So that's 2 of the cases where we limit the generations. And Rav's 3rd case is that his daughter's daughter-in-law is prohibited. But if you add another generation, a person's daughter's daughter-in-law is permitted. Okay, we're going to see it only applies to a daughter's daughter-in-law, not a son's daughter-in-law. So those are the 3 cases that I've mentioned. But he did say 4. Uz'iri Mosif Moziri lets us know what that 4th case is. Af eshet avi imo. Also, this case, eshet avi imo, that would be his mother's father's wife. That is his step-grandmother. But from his mother's father. But if you add another generation, then that would be the mother's father's father's wife, then that is permitted, right? This is all on his mother, a man's mother's side, not his father's side. Okay, so Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak v'simanech di'ilai derav. If you want to remember which of these 4 is mentioned by Ze'iri, so remember that Ze'iri is above Rav. and the sense that he's talking about generations above, beforehand, whereas Rav was talking about generations below. That is in the case of daughter-in-law. Rav was talking about it, their generation below. In the case of uncle, he was just talking about one generation above, and Ze'iri is talking about a case of 2 generations above, and that's why Ze'iri is, we remember it by the mnemonic that he is above. Okay, Verav, how come Rav did not mention the case of Ze'iri? The answer is Mechalfale be'eshet avi aviv. Did not want to mention the case because it's confusing. Because if you would go and tell people that one's mother's father's wife is permitted, then that's confusing because it looks the same as one's father's wife, and that case is prohibited. And so therefore, Rav kind of added his own gezerah. Maybe he thought that it's permitted, but he didn't want to mention it because he does mention 4 cases. But he didn't want to mention the 4th because these are matters of arayot, in which this is the reason why we don't talk about arayot in public. Right? It's so easy to make a mistake which way it is. So that's why he didn't want to mention this 4th case, and only Ze'iri did. Okay, who is Ze'iri? Ze'iri was not worried about mentioning this case because a person often goes to his father's house, and so all the relations on his father's side is, these are my close relatives. He's not going to marry them. Whereas a person does not get together with his mother's side of the family as often, and so therefore this relative on his mother's side was like, I never saw that, I never see that person, and will is permitted, and is permitted, okay, and that case is permitted anyway. So the mother's side is okay, and he doesn't have to worry that is going to misinterpret it with his father's side, because on his father's side he's always there, and so he knows, this is my father's side. Those are definitely prohibited. All right, kalato. I've mentioned the daughter-in-law. He just said that word, kalato. He didn't specify what it is, so we ask, one cannot take his daughter-in-law. So that's right there in the Torah. So what are you talking about? Which case, Rav, are you mentioning? Kalat benod. Are you talking about the son's daughter-in-law? Kalat beno yesh la hefsek. But that can't be, because do generations stop regarding one's son's daughter-in-law? V'hatanya, we have a b'raita. This is opposite. Kalato erva, one's daughter-in-law is erva. Kalat beno sheniya, his son's daughter-in-law is secondary. V'chan tamer bibno ben beno asof kol hadorot. His son's daughter-in-law is prohibited in all generations. So Rav could not have been limiting that side. Elaema kalat bito. So now we can figure out that he was only talking about the daughter. His daughter's daughter-in-law. That's what goes only one generation, but not further. And we know this from a story. Rav says, I heard this from a great sage, Mano Rabbi Ameh. And Rabbi Ameh said, Lo asru kala elam mipnei kala. Rabbi Ameh said a mysterious statement that they only prohibited a daughter-in-law because of a daughter-in-law. This makes no sense. Now, Rav Chisda did not understand the statement that he heard from Rabbi Ameh. However, in the meantime, he went to astrologers, and the astrologer says, you're going to be a teacher. But he didn't know what kind of teacher. Amina This says, if I'm going to be a great sage, meaning go and teach in public, then I'll be able to crack this code and figure out what Rabbi Ameh said on my own. However, I know I'm going to be a teacher, he's trusted the astrologer, but if I'm going to just be an elementary school teacher, then, I won't be able to figure it out on my own, and I'll have to go ask the sages in the synagogue and ask them what he meant by it. So this is his test for himself to know what level teacher he's going to be. And sure enough, he was able to figure out what Rabbi Ameh meant on his own. And what he meant is, Lo asru kalat bito ela mishum kalat bito beno. That the rabbis prohibited the daughter-in-law of his daughter only because of the daughter-in-law of his son. And so therefore the main prohibition that the rabbis made was, Torah says daughter-in-law. The rabbis came and said son's daughter-in-law is added to that. Then added a secondary prohibition is daughter-in-law because it's very easy to mix it up with son's daughter-in-law. But whereas son's daughter-in-law goes on forever, daughter's daughter-in-law stops after one generation. And there you go. That's what the Biyameh meant, that they prohibited one daughter-in-law because of another daughter-in-law, right? The sons, they prohibited the daughters because of the son's daughter-in-law. Okay, if you're having trouble following this, then don't feel bad, because even Abaye had to explain it to Rava with a real life situation, like the daughter-in-law in the house of Bar Sitai. Where in that house, we don't know who these people are, but in the house there lived both daughter-in-laws from his son and daughter-in-laws from his daughter. And you see that since they're all living together, it's easy to confuse one with the other. Rav Papa in the next generation, Amar Kegon Kalata Debe Rav Papa Bar Abba, he gave his own example. Rav Ashe Amar in the yet next generation, the sixth generation, Kegon Kalata Debe Mari Bar Isak, he gave another example. All these are examples of where a daughter-in-law from a son and a daughter-in-law from a daughter were all living together, and that's why the rabbis prohibited one because of the other. Okay, and now we get to the case that we have left out so far. Eshet achi ha'em min ha'em. What about the wife of one's mother's maternal brother? What is the case regarding that? Eshet achi ha'av min ha'em, ve'eshet achi ha'ev min ha'am, dik asad av hu degazru banan, aval hecha delek asad av lo gazru behu rabanan, o diama lo shena. Okay, so we have to go back and see that the Torah itself in Vayikra Yudchet only says that a father's brother's wife is prohibited, which the rabbis understand to mean the father's paternal brother's wife is prohibited. So that's all we know midoraita, going only men, right? Father's paternal. And so the rabbis then are going to extend that in every possible direction, one step. So one step removed from that would be to add a woman either in either case, either it's his mother's paternal brother, prohibited shiniyot, or his father's maternal brother's wife, and that, so we're also adding. But how about going two steps removed to say the mother's maternal maternal brother's wife? The rabbis extend their gezerah all the way there, or not. Since there's no side of the father at all, the rabbis do not make a gezerah, or do they not make a difference and they make a gezerah even there? Okay, so Amar Rav Safra, hi gufa gezerah, v'ana nekom v'nigzor gezerah ligzerah. Hold on, the mother's paternal half brother, that itself is one gezerah, and we have a general rule: you don't go ahead and make a secondary gezerah to a first gezerah. So Rav Safra asks a solid question, and according to that, since you don't make a gezerah to another gezerah, then the mother's maternal brother's wife should be permitted. But Rava is going to challenge Rav Safra based on several other cases where we do see that the rabbis do make something that looks like a gezerah ligzerah. And so he says, Amar Rava, tu kuluhu lav gezerah ligzerah. And look at all the other cases that are also a gezerah ligzerah, and yet the rabbis do it. Right? They include everything all together because it's still confusing. For example, imo irva, one's mother is prohibited. Imo sheniya, and then the rabbi, that's the doraita. The rabbis came and added his mother's grandmother. Vegazru al em aviv mishum em imo, and then although primarily it's only mother's mother that they added, but then they came and added to that also one's father's mother because of mother's mother. So that's a secondary gezerah. And the reason is because you call them the same name. You still call the person grandmother. They're all part of the house of the grandmother. And so therefore, it's really all included in one gezerah, it's one lump gezerah, even though it's two steps that are included there that would in the confusion. Another example, Eshet Aviv Erva. A person's stepmother, his father's wife, is prohibited midoraita. Eshet Avi Aviv, his father's wife, is the rabbis add as a shiniyah. Begazru al Eshet Avi Imo, so his grandfather on his mother's side's wife is also prohibited mishum Eshet Avi Aviv because of the grandfather on the father's side. So that's a secondary. You can call that a gizera ligzera, but it's not because they're all called together the house of the grandfather, and so they're really all included in just one gizera. Another example, Eshet Achi Ha'av Min Ha'av Irva. This is our example. So the wife of his father's paternal brother, that's the Torah says, Eshet Achi Ha'av Min Ha'em Sheniya, the wife of his maternal, of his mother's paternal brother is the secondary. Begazru al Eshet Achi Ha'em Min Ha'av Mishum Eshet Achi Ha'av Min Ha'em. And then the rabbis added to that the wife of his father's maternal brother, his wife should be prohibited also because it's confusing with his mother's paternal brother's wife. Vetamamai, and even though this looks like it's a second step, mishum dekuluhu debedode karuhu, because they're all called uncles, and therefore they're really all one gezerah, and so therefore one could, by that justification, also add in another person that's called uncle, that is the mother's maternal brother's wife. I mean, aunt. She's called aunt, his uncle's wife. Okay, so all right, so now we rejected Rav Safra's claim, and so we still don't have an answer. Is it permitted or not? Tashema Techiyat Rav Yehuda bar Shela Amar Amri b'Marava. When Rav Yehuda bar Shela came from Eretz Yisrael, he reported Kol shebenekeva irva bazachar gazru al ishto mishum sheniya. Anytime that we have a prohibition against a certain woman, in that same relation, if there's a man, then his wife also will be prohibited, right? So any structure of relationship that a woman is prohibited, also a man in that same relationship's wife will also be prohibited. Now, Rava came and objected to this. Vamarava uklalahu, is that really a rule? Here's a few exceptions. Hamoto irva Eshet Hamiv muteret. Bat Chamoto erva, Eshet Bat Chamoto muteret. Bat Chamiv erva, Eshet Ben Chamiv muteret. Choragto erva, Eshet Chorgo muteret. Bat Choragto erva, Eshet Ben Chorgo muteret. We have a mother-in-law is forbidden, but a father-in-law's wife is permitted. A mother-in-law's daughter is forbidden by the Torah, because that would be his wife's sister, but his mother-in-law's son's wife is permitted. They're not related at all. His father-in-law's daughter is prohibited. That's by the Torah. Yet the wife of his father-in-law's son is permitted. His stepdaughter is forbidden. That's by Torah. But the stepson's wife is permitted. A stepson's daughter, that's his wife's granddaughter, that's forbidden. But the wife of his stepson's son is permitted. So here are a bunch of exceptions to the rule of Rav Yehuda bar Shela. So then we ask, Rav Yehuda bar Shela, when he says this is a general rule, it doesn't mean it across the board. So what's he coming to include that would be that this would apply to? That may not be obvious. Must be it's his mother's maternal brother's wife, and that is prohibited because because an aunt is prohibited, and so this would be the same relation of his uncle's wife would also be prohibited. And there you go. So even though the Braita that we started with that listed everyone did not mention this, and so the Peshat of that Braita may be that this is permitted, but based on this rule, we're going to add also this case to be prohibited. And now the question is, what's the difference between these cases here where we said we don't use the mirror rule and this we permit, whereas here we do use this mirror rule and we prohibit the mother's maternal brother's wife. The answer is because in the case of the mother's maternal brother, mother, maternal brother, those are all blood relations. And so it only takes one kiddushin, that, right, his mother's maternal brother, to marry, and then she becomes prohibited. So since it's only one kiddushin there, so that's closer. Whereas the cases that the mirror rule does not apply to, for example, here, where this is one's mother-in-law is prohibited, but the same relation, his father-in-law, right? His father-in-law is the same relation as his mother-in-law, and yet his father-in-law's wife is permitted. And the reason here is because this requires two acts of kiddushin. He has to do kiddushin with the daughter, and the father has to do kiddushin with this other wife. And so because this is a two-step kiddushin, therefore we do not apply the mirror rule to these cases, but we do apply it to all to the uncle because that's only one kiddushin. Last case. Shalach le Rab Meshashia metusnaya le Rav Papi. Yilamdenu Rabenu eshet achi avi ha'av. Until now, we're talking about aunts, but now we're asking about great aunts. What about a father's wife, or eshet achi avi av, or achot avi av, the sister of the father's father, right? So these two cases here, right? A father's brother's wife, or a father's sister, right? So either way, a great aunt from his father's side, is it permitted or not? So here's the two sides. Since one generation less is certainly prohibited, right? That would be an aunt on the father's side is prohibited. So this also is prohibited. Or once you go from aunt to great aunt, so now there's another generation separating, and so it should be permitted. That's the question, and we try to answer it. Tashema mahen sheniyot. The Braita that we started off all the way back mentioned, here's all the secondary prohibitions, and did not mention anything about great aunts. So therefore, it should be permitted. But not necessarily Tana b'sheyed. Maybe that Braita listed some of the prohibitions, but not all of them. Just like we saw just now, a mother's maternal brother's wife was not mentioned, and yet we established that as prohibited. So maybe it left these out. And can you prove, are there other things that for sure it left out, that you would say it also left out these? And we answer yes. The Chaya had a list of secondary relationships that are prohibited, and that list is bigger than the list we just had. So you see, all these are also excluded. So therefore, we can say there are other cases that are also excluded, and even so, therefore, even though the Baraita did not mention these, it still could be that they are prohibited, and we will leave these lists to analyze for tomorrow. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.